Good afternoon. Di Lee's the former director of this august institution, and actually the person who managed to leverage the money from the filmmakers from They Shall Not Grow Old that funded the 1418 Legacy Fund, which gives her the right to be cheeky, has just said that this morning's session was absolutely brilliant and no pressure on us this afternoon. Actually, because of the two artists who are on the panel, there is no pressure, but the chair's got to do his job. I'm here, I think, because for the last 8 years I've had the privilege of chairing the Arts Commissioning Committee, which is a wonderful institution in British art, emanating from this institution, that then had the job, again, the privilege of administering the 1418 Legacy Fund to over 20 projects, including 5 what I call landmark projects. And you've heard from Northern Ireland, or seen something which happened in Northern Ireland this morning. This afternoon, we've got 2 more of the landmarks from Baltic in Gateshead, Newcastle, and Glynn Vivian in Swansea. The 2 artists have connections, but obviously we're going to look at their projects as standalone. Michael Rakowitz is an American artist of Iraqi heritage who lives and works in Chicago, who has major international profile. He's shown at Documenta 13. At the last count, there was Istanbul Biennale, Sharjah Biennale, and Sydney Biennale. He's also no stranger to us in London. He had a major show at the Whitechapel, which went to Castello di Rivoli in Italy, in Turin, but also did the 4th plinth from the end of 2018 to 2020, the Assyrian figure, the human head, the winged bull made of date syrup tins. Heather Phillipson is a London-born, London-based artist whose formative years were spent in Wales, so we'll find out how much that informed the collaboration she did at Glynn Vivian shortly. She again has international profile. She's shown at the Sharjah Biennale, Athens Biennale. She also has shown at Tate Britain. She's a Turner Prize nominee from 2020, but she followed Michael onto the 4th plinth in 2022. The End, the piece that you remember with drones, flies, whipped cream and a cherry. Both artists wrestle with the political, the social, but from interesting personal perspectives. They're both multidisciplinary artists, no question. Michael has been described as a part-time chef and detective as well as an artist. Heather's not just been described as a poet, she's a published poet, she's a trained musician, she's a DJ as well as an artist. They're both going to show a brief film, or we are going to show a brief film of each of the commissions, and then the conversation will take place and we'll open it to the floor towards the end, all being well. So, first up, the commission from Baltic Gateshead, Michael Rakowitz's The Waiting Gardens of the North.
My name is Michael Rakowitz. I'm an artist living and working in Chicago, and we're here at the Waiting Gardens of the North, which is a project that I collaborated with the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art, the Imperial War Museum, and local refugees and asylum seekers. And so when it turned out that the city had not given permission to the Baltic to have the garden outdoors, I thought about this space that we're in right now, which is the 4th floor gallery space that has these windows that run the entire length of the space on both sides, and they're angled, and they're usually kept with blinds so that the light levels won't harm any of the sculptures or the paintings or the drawings that are often exhibited in here. But if we open up those blinds, we end up with a sort of makeshift greenhouse. And it's populated with trees and plants that have been chosen in collaboration and in consultation with some of the people from these countries where they've had to flee from wars, and have ended up at places like the Comfrey Project, where they're able to engage in gardening as a kind of practice while they're waiting. So they're making things take root while they themselves are waiting to take root in their new home. And so a lot of these plants that we're surrounded by are plants that grow in the places where they fled from, and they become like these portals to home. In a space like this, in a space like a museum, or in a space like a library, there's an opportunity to slow down. I wanted to create a space where there wasn't an end, and where things could slow down. People could be with these other living entities that experience not only the sunlight and the water, but if we think about their cousins and brothers and sisters that are growing in the soil in places like, Aleppo or Mosul, that we know that their lives, that this non-human life is also threatened.
It's been absolutely wonderful to work in partnership with Glynn Vivian from an IWM perspective on this wonderful project. The IWM 1480 Now Legacy Fund is a series of 20 commissions across the UK, working in all different ways with contemporary artists to bring new stories about conflict to life. And this project has just been an absolute dream project to work on. The work is an incredibly ambitious exploration of conflict in its broadest terms. I think that Heather really brings to life some very big universal themes about the experience of conflict, what it feels like, and a kind of embodied, multi-sensory experience of conflict. The kind of transformative impact of Heather's work on the Glynn Vivian spaces is really something to behold.
I knew that it was going to be about conflict, but coming into it, the space feels so not peaceful, but kind of meditative and reflective.
I was sort of surprised by everything. I didn't expect to see the show sort of transform the space as it did. I loved the walking in and the kind of the shock of seeing these sort of lovely floating forms, and the sound as well. Amazing job of making space that's so familiar to me, like just be something quite magical.
I was absolutely amazed when I stepped into the exhibition space, that the sheer height of the exhibition and how it fills the whole space just really, really impressed me.
I also love the way you're kind of integrated with the second floor, which sort of speaks to a kind of more Welsh history, but also addresses the idea of conflict. In a sense, like walking through the room that Heather Phillipson curated herself, it kind of really occurred to me that when we think of war in our heads, we think of it as this horrible thing. And of course it is, but strangely, there's a seduction in the works as well. I mean, there's something really beautiful, almost sublime, about the way she's chosen these forms that are actually destructive forms.
So the framing of this session, this discussion, is transformation, the power of art to transform the way we see things, but also the way that artists transform spaces. You both have clearly transformed the spaces. Heather, you took on 3 levels, or 2 levels, and then galleries. We get a flavour of the work, but where was the starting point?
Good, it is on, I wasn't sure. So when I was first invited to make something for this commission, it coincided with the Pentagon's report into unidentified aerial phenomena. And something that really struck me was a line in the report that, so there'd been something that had been identified in the skies, and it was thought to be Russian interference, and then it turned out to be a weather balloon, and there was a line that was something like, it was just a sadly deflating balloon. And already this image was in my head, like the radical kind of discrepancy between the sort of fantasy of what this thing could be and the kind of mundanity of what it actually was. And so already my head was kind of in the skies, thinking about military things that might be happening beyond the ground, which of course is how a lot of military conduct happens anyway, and thinking about warfare as something that's far more distributed and dispersed and often dematerialized than we necessarily think of it. So I guess I started thinking about all of these things together and felt very strongly that I wanted to do something that had this much more kind of ethereal, meteorological kind of tone to it that would somehow, take in this idea of like these weather balloons that could also be malevolent objects floating in the skies. And Wales has a very close history with radar, so that was another reason that I was kind of thinking about this idea of I guess like kind of how to identify objects in space, which is also obviously something that radar does, and then bringing that together with sound, which is something that I'll probably talk about more, but that was my kind of initial
trigger
way in.
A story that's a trigger that then you talk about on occasion a visual and acoustic fog, and obviously that idea of the fog of war is a profound idea, going back to Clausewitz, but also Robert McNamara's film and so on. So rather than try and make sense out of the fog of war, you're trying to create something akin to a visual and acoustic fog for the visitor to experience.
Yeah, I was very acutely aware that I wanted to do something that could be kind of felt and sensed, so that the atmosphere in the room would be palpable. And again, to go back to this kind of meteorological aspect of it, that there in the show there is air and liquid from the fog curtain and fog, and there are these kinds of gestures towards things that are happening atmospherically. And that, it would be something that within which one would become kind of saturated as a viewer, and trying to represent something that seeps into you in the way that, warfare is also a kind of a perceptual phenomenon, that it's something that is, as well as being something that is like a literal, very physical assault, that also how sound and atmosphere is used in war and, exploited to certain effects. And so it was very much, for me, these kind of ways into thinking about it.
Michael, the piece is a garden, but it's a community-engaged project as well. And you talk about working with displaced people. But where was the starting point? Was it a specific historical object, or am I over-interpreting?
No. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone at IWM and everyone at Baltic. Sophie Richardson, without whom the project would not have happened, is in the audience. So, and thanks to all the community partners there. The invitation was a little strange because I was approached to actually think about a garden. And so it was immediately something that I connected to public space. And as I said in the video, for very uninteresting reasons, the city said that the garden couldn't happen outside, and we found a way of making it happen inside. But I'm not a gardener. you know, although I'd love to be. My wife is actually the person who plants things in our garden. I'm always very jealous that she has the ability to kind of organize her time in her day where she has time to do that. But I've always been super interested in the time that it takes and the kind of transformation one can observe, so much change taking place. And so when I started to think about the garden, I started to think about the way in which the framing of the project with the IWM and the Legacy Fund was looking at it being a kind of garden for displaced people, and thinking about the Islamic garden as a kind of, as a point of inspiration. And so that immediately brought me into the kind of research that I've done for a long time into Mesopotamian artifacts, and thinking about some of the things that I've observed in the panels and the reliefs that I've been reappearing with my studio assistants of artifacts that were destroyed by ISIS in 2015 and had also been looted in the aftermath of the US-led invasion in 2003. And there's a panel that's in the British Museum that they called the Garden Stela, that comes from Nineveh, and it was produced under the reign of Ashurbanipal, and it depicts this really incredible garden formation that is terraced and rather complex in the way that the waterways and everything else is rendered. And there's an archaeologist named Stephanie Daly here in the UK, who has actually argued that this myth around the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was actually in Nineveh, and that early travelers, people like Strabo, had actually gotten the location wrong. And when they went to places like Nineveh in northern Iraq, and they saw these large boulders moved in order to deviate water, that this is where it was. So I was interested in that relief in and of itself, but I was actually interested also in the myth of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, because it was built as a kind of garden of homesickness. It was built by Nebuchadnezzar for his wife Amatis, who came from Medea, which is now modern-day Iran, and she missed the mountains of home. And so the myth is that the garden was made so that she could have more proximity to that kind of landscape and would feel more at home. And when I thought about the homesickness that comes from being displaced, and thinking about the connection of this particular object that's being held in the British Museum to what's happening there now, I thought about what it means for someone who's displaced by war, that's being waged from the position of empire in the global north and in the west, from the country that I'm from the country we're in now. I started to think about the homesickness of the asylum seeker or the refugee, being forced to leave a place, but then being homesick for the place that they're trying to get to. And thinking about the cruelty of waiting that people are put through when they are in this kind of liminal position of being someone who is fleeing and is not being welcomed, but is actually having their fate decided by bureaucracies that are under constant political pressure. And as we're seeing, so much of the racism that exists in our societies are keeping these people from being at home.
So an historical tablet and a myth was the structure, if you like, of the work. How engaged were you with contemporary displaced people?
Well, because the Baltic already has a very strong relationship with people in those communities, it was very easy. I consider myself a site-specific artist, meaning that I go to places and I allow for the kind of interactions to sculpt what it is that's being made. And so when I arrived wanting to work with displaced people, well, it turns out that the Baltic Centre for Contemporary Art, their learning team and the entire ethos of the museum has already been engaged with these places like the Comfrey Project, which is in Gateshead. And they've been working with them for years. And at the Comfrey Project, these people who have been displaced, they're not allowed to work, which is an insult. And so what so many of them go to do is to actually plant trees and to plant herbs and all kinds of structures that they build to make things grow. And so these were already existing relationships. And so it felt as though the project was really something that was able to kind of, in a way, foreground what was already happening at the museum. And the museum is considered a sanctuary space. And so it more or less just emphasized what was happening. So it was one of the easiest experiences I've ever had in being introduced to a community, because it's this exemplary institution that is not doing it out of purely symbolic reasons, but because its ethos is like so directly tied to resisting what might be a larger national attitude and creating their own realities.
Heather, you mentioned the kind of ethereal nature of your project, or rather out of this world, more expansive, but there were such site-specific engagements. You mentioned Welsh history and radar. How much local research did you do, and how directly engaged was the project in the end with a local community?
It wasn't really directly engaged with the local community as such. I mean, I think it's interesting the term site-specific, because in a way, arguably, my work is also site-specific, but more maybe in the sense that it's about whatever building or landscape I'm putting my work into, I want that building or landscape to become part of the work. And in a sense, I want that to become part of the imaginary landscape of the work as well, so that when somebody crosses into that, they're kind of entering a hermetic environment, a different... I mean, Michael used the word portal in his film as well, and I think that's also what I'm looking for often in my work. So it's kind of, it is an opening for the audience, and that can be anybody who attends without being, there was no sort of specific local engagement as such, but I did bring in the work of a kind of pioneer of sound and image, a Welsh artist. I don't know if she would have identified as an artist, but she was ostensibly a singer. Her name was Margaret Watts-Hughes. And she made these incredible works that she called voice figures, where she used the resonance of her voice to create images on glass. And they've almost never been shown, but I'd come across them years ago in some research. And when I was invited to do the show in Wales, I said, oh, could we involve her archive, and Glynn Vivian, the gallery that I was working with, who, thanks to them as well, they're not here. Michael was more polite than me. He thanked his partners straight away, who were absolutely brilliant as well. And they kind of negotiated with Cyfarthfa Castle, where the works were being stored, and they were brought out, and they hadn't seen the light of day for 70 years or something. I'm sort of going off on a bit of a tangent, but this is kind of the Welsh connection to the work in a way. And although they weren't sort of directly related to conflict or warfare, because it was so, her way of producing images from sound was so pertinent to what I was kind of, one of the things that I was trying to think about in my work, and this kind of transposition from one medium to another. And they had their own very ethereal presence, and I decided to hang them, to suspend them, so that they could be lit with light coming through them. So again, they had this very kind of phantasmagorical quality, and kind of that kept them in keeping with what I was trying to do on the floor downstairs, with suspended things and light coming through things, and again, kind of trying to create this atmosphere.
It's a really interesting I'd say, organic process. Michael's is literally organic, but it's interesting how all these ideas, research, they come together in your work. You've described your work as quantum thought experiments, which I think is a brilliant description. But how much, when you start to install, are you in control of what's going to happen? And how much are you letting the installation take over?
Well, to a certain extent, I'm in control of every detail because that's how I think and function. So before something gets installed, I've considered every detail, and I can kind of see everything in my mind's eye. I don't tend to work with architectural models, or I just kind of know how something's going to work. I see it and I lay it all out in my mind. And then I work with whoever the team is that I'm working with and produce kind of images for them to work from to realise whatever this vision is I've got in my mind. But then obviously once it's in the space, it's as new to me as it is to almost anybody when I'm walking into that, because it's only ever existed in that space other than in my head. It's very different to walk into something in 4, 5 dimensions, however many dimensions it might have. And to experience it myself. And at that point, I feel very much like I'm not in control of it, and that this is a cliche, but you produce something, then it goes out and it does what it does, and at that point you relinquish control of it. And again, once it encounters other people coming into that space, they change it, and they have their own relationship to it, and those relationships proliferate. And I guess because plurality is always such an important part of my work, I'm always embracing that, and I want that the kind of chaos, for want of a better word, that might come out of that, all of those potential openings. Michael, planting is, well, precarious, but there's a fragility. Things take root, sometimes they don't. But you're very much in control of the structure of the work. Did anything surprise you about the way it actually manifested itself, or was it very clear fairly early on as to what it was going to be?
No, I think it was, a garden will always surprise you, because you'll expect for certain things to happen, and then other things will take place. And I think that I love losing that control, actually. I think that I'm very interested in chance operations when it comes to contemporary art, and I also welcome the kind of dialogue with community to change those things that I might come into a kind of situation with. And I think what surprised me most about the garden was that it worked, actually. One of the things that I found really inspiring was working with the head gardener of the Waiting Gardens of the North, this incredible gardener named Nicola Bentham, who was working at Seton Delaval when we first met her. And so she, was very adamant about just foregrounding the life of a plant, and not just showing the plant in life, but also showing when it dies into itself, when it goes to seed. And then as the seasons changed, we changed the different plants and maintained the dialogue with the people in the communities. So, and sometimes, it was really great for passion flower to grow, and then in another season it was really good for lamb's ear to grow, and then somebody at the Baltic team found out that lamb's ear was used to tend to people's wounds in the trenches.
Yeah, it absorbs blood, yeah.
Yeah, and so there are all those stories that, I, as somebody who might, be a part of the instigation of the work, am never really expecting to emerge. But those are the things that happen. And then, there's this wonderful story of this woman named Grace, who was seeking asylum from Namibia. And she just kept talking about this plant called welwitschia, which is a really delicate plant that kind of always looks like it's dead. But it grows, it's a very hardy plant that grows in the Namibian desert. And in the case where we couldn't find certain plants, we would provide substitutes, which I love actually, because substitutes, I do a lot of cooking in my work, and as somebody gets further away from the place where they're from, you have to use substitutes sometimes. And in this case, there was no substitute for Welwitschia. And we found actually this gardener in Reading who was growing them. And so we arranged for the Welwitschia to be brought on the train by the gardener to the space. And Grace was so proud of it that she got in contact with the ambassador from Namibia who visited the plant. And I think the plan was for that plant to go and live with Grace and her family afterwards. And if not, it was going to go to the embassy. So those kinds of things where the plant actually became an event, like that. I think it's the plant that you see in the video. So I'm like carrying this plant, and it doesn't look like much. And so there were sometimes like signs that the gallery had to put up to say, hey, if you think this is looking unhealthy, it's not, So sometimes, like what we expect from plants, when we think that they're always supposed to be looking lush and green, it's not the case. That there's seasonal changes, and for perennials, they'll do different things throughout the year. But those always became an opportunity for storytelling. So somebody might be able to say if an olive tree wasn't looking so good, somebody from Palestine would be able to tie that story, with the olive tree that's in recovery, to the political situation that they're going through.
What about audience response in Glynn Vivian? Were there resonant responses that you encountered, or did you detach yourself from it and just let people get on with it?
I always just let people get on with it. There was a visitor's comment book which I haven't seen, so who knows what's in there.
So completely different approaches in that sense. Although both of you deal with fragility and I suppose the risk that things don't always succeed. What would you have done differently now you've seen the work in place? What would you amend? What do you learn from the process of making it? Or is that not how you work? You just let it go?
Sometimes I can have certain thoughts about things I would have done differently, but I think generally my process that it's more subtle, as in it might inform what I do next, kind of more or less indirectly, rather than, oh, I wish I'd done that differently. Because again, it's this thing of it being new to me to a certain extent as well, and that it's its own thing. And at that point, it's like I can no longer interfere with it because it's complete as it is, and I'm kind of slightly separate from it. But the experience of all of these things always informs something about how I approach whatever comes next. And I guess that's the nature of a practice as well, is that you're always learning something. And maybe you don't even know what you've learned in a way that you can articulate, but that it might just come through in what you do.
Does the idea of conflict as a way of working appeal to you, or does that inform some things of what you do? Is there a sense of conflict between different forms, different senses, you and the space?
It's interesting because when I was invited to do this commission and I heard the word conflict, I was a bit like, conflict? What am I going to do with that? And then actually I thought conflict is inherent to my work in many ways, because I'm always trying to hold together potential contradictory positions. And I've often said that my work exists in the not only, that it's not only this, it's also this and this, and, to go back to that idea of plurality, and that sometimes those things can be in contradiction. So, like there was somebody in that video that said something like it feels very contemplative or serene or something. And that might coexist with the fact that the genesis of this show came out of ideas of violence and warfare. And yet perhaps the lived experience of being in that space becomes something quite different. So I guess potentially that is a form of conflict, or how what seem to be opposing ideas might rub together somehow.
It's interesting though, because having seen Michael's work first, where certainly when the film ended, you had this sense of a contemplative space, a garden space. And then you went to your work and it seemed much more animated and dissonant, and yet the person's response was, it was meditative to be inside it. I suppose that's losing a sense of self inside the fog, the acoustic and visual fog of war, I guess. Do audiences, in the way they respond, are you surprised by what people do and how they respond to your work? Is there a sociological aspect? Are you interested in people's behaviour?
I suppose so. I mean, obviously, because my work is often, I quite often think about the sort of procession through the space. So when I'm envisaging something within a space, I'm often thinking about the sort of sequencing of things. I've talked before, and this is relevant to this project, about my work kind of always aspiring to the condition of music to some extent. And in that respect, there's always this kind of, I guess there are these build-ups and anticipatory moments and things that get revealed, or things that you can't see at certain points, they're behind you, but then there's something else that's through a door or behind, that's screened behind something that only gets revealed when you move through it. And so in that sense, I guess, because I'm often thinking about people's spatial progress through the work and the encounter with the different bits of it, there is a behavioural aspect, and there is again, you know, there's often those aren't totally prescribed routes. They're up to the person within the space to navigate. But I guess what's more interesting to me is what people read into it sometimes, you know. So I'm thinking, for example, of just the commission that I did at Tate Britain in the Devines, and the reactions were, the difference between the reactions was so extreme, you know, that some people were saying it was like a fun fair and some people were saying it was like catastrophe and the end of the world, which you couldn't really get more extreme than those two readings of it. So it was things like that I found very interesting.
Whereas in your case, you're not soliciting extreme responses, but it's individual experiences being tapped, isn't it, with each and every plant and with the communities that you're engaging with. So in a sense, the melting pot is there from the beginning. You will have extreme reactions. How much do you consciously, I was going to use the word choreograph, but play with contemporary political resonance in terms of conflicts that are happening now in the world? And how much does history and the referencing of individual communities and displaced people, how much does it do it for you?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, you start with history, you're dealing with displaced people now. Are you consciously choreographing specific conflicts in the world at the moment? For example, the Israeli-Palestine conflict was referenced in response to your work because of the olive trees and the displacement of land. Is that something you're consciously putting into the mix, or are you, by definition, allowing individual responses to make those readings? It's not something you're pushing.
I think, you know, I'm conscious of it. You know, just living in the world and, you know, coming from the family that I come from and, you know, living in a country that is enabling, you know, so many of these conflicts. I think it's impossible when you see a rose that's called a damask rose and to not be thinking about Damascus and to thinking about, you know, the city in Syria where it's from, Douma. You know, there's this quote that I found of somebody who was talking about how endangered that rose is, you know, that instead of smelling like roses, now the city smells like gunpowder. So it's a little hard for that not to find its way into the work. It's not so much a choreography as much as it's like, you know, I'll put that into the text, you know, that's in the work, and then I find the formal kinds of structures that are already there. Like when you go to a garden, you expect to see a label, and that label tells you what that plant is, right? And so you have the British Museum and you have the ventriloquizations of all of those objects by empire that have taken these things. You have Kew Gardens, which in and of itself is an imperial structure that is like uprooted these things and is planting them, and it's telling the story from the position of empire. And I wanted to kind of like de-ventriloquize these plants. And so the stories that you read on those labels are the stories of the people who are participating in the project, and say they have their own stories to tell. But in the case of something like the Damask Rose, I would cull that comment, that statement from the gardener and Duma, and actually, have that be the thing that you're reading. So there's a bit of a choreography, but it's like a collective experience where the people who I'm working with get to make their own moves within that choreography. They get to have their own, handwriting, their own text. So my hope is that it's just part of a chorus, and not so much about something being institutionalized from my position. So I don't always go looking for it, but I think it's impossible to escape it sometimes, and as a lot of the plants that are in that garden are also representative of the plants that we're growing in Nineveh under Ashurbanipal's garden, or Sennacherib's garden, and also Nebuchadnezzar's garden. And so when we showed that list of those things like fig trees and olive trees and tamarisk, the people that we were meeting with in these community, they call it community, right? And it happens every first Sunday of each month. And so they would read these lists and they'd be like, oh yes, we have that too, but we also have this, which you should try to get. And so then before you know it, somebody from Iran is doing an illustration of the plant on the label and then writing a story or a recipe of how it's used. So it's not always just also about conflict ventriloquizing the plant, but then somebody saying, well, this is how resilient it is. We still make food from this and we grow it here.
I think that's one of the most potent aspects of your work is, fragile as things are, there's always a sense of fragility and of resilience and possibility. That there's hope. Briefly, before I throw you to the floor, legacy. I mean, we'll talk about broader legacy of this at the very end, but what's the specific legacy of each of your projects? I mean, in your case, the plants are being dispersed. Where?
So a lot of them have gone to people's homes. A lot of them have gone to the community partners that we worked with, like Comfrey Project, Scotswood Gardens, Dalston Physic Gardens. So the footprint of the work has actually expanded beyond the Baltic. The garden is able to do now what it wanted to do in the first place, which was to exist in public space. So it's gone from, the fourth floor.
Hot house of the museum. Yeah.
Right, yeah, and it's gone into the world, which I love. It's nice to think about, sitting with a plant like somebody sits with an artwork, and I always think, instead of talking about collecting art, I think a better way of talking about it is living with art. That you choose to live with a painting, you choose to live with a sculpture, you choose to live with a plant. And so that for me, was really a nice part of it. The other thing that I would have loved to see continue is that we had a kitchen in the garden, which would be the site of many community meals. And that part of the project I found was in dialogue with something that Sandy Halal, the Palestinian architect, has, which is called Al-Madhafa, which means the living room. And what she's found out through her own research and doing work with refugee communities in places like Sweden is that, like here, they're put into these kinds of situations where they're living in a hotel that don't have any kitchens, and it takes away the right to host. And when you take away someone's right to host, if they're coming from Iraq or Syria or Pakistan or Afghanistan, that's a very, very serious kind of obstacle that you're creating there. And so what Sandy is interested in doing in her work is setting up these situations around the world that my project that the Baltic ended up becoming part of, which is where you return the right to host to somebody who's displaced, where they themselves can interrupt their perpetual status as a guest and can suddenly host. And so some of those community meals were hosted by this incredible cook named Sohaina and others. And so that was also part of the legacy, but it also makes me sad to think about the fact that that once that space ended, you know, that we're still sort of fighting for that right to host.
Heather, what about legacy of your piece? It's much less literal. Where will it take your own practice? What have you learned from the piece, and what impact do you hope it's had?
Firstly, just in terms of like the legacy of the work within the gallery, I think maybe for me something much more kind of metaphysical and perhaps mystical, which is how art might have the capacity to kind of change the vibration of a space. So, you know, for people that knew the Glynn Vivian already and then saw it in that state, and how that, the kind of, the imprint of that might somehow stay in the space and change it. And I do think that I've had that experience with artworks in places that I know, that once they've been there and I've experienced them in that place place is different, you know, that every time you go, you've still got the kind of afterglow of that previous iteration of something in that space. But also, for me, being able to show Margaret Watts Hughes's work and to have that being recognised and seen, and for it to literally be brought into the light and for people to have access to that, and maybe for her to be better known, that felt like a very important legacy. In terms of how it might inform my own practice going forwards, I think there was programming involved, you know, because I had the automated gongs that were being played, and the crystal healing bowls that were kind of self-playing, and that's definitely something that I would like to use more, I think, or experiment with more going forwards.
Watch or listen to this space, yeah. As they say. Other questions on the floor? We've got about 10 minutes, and I know there's many people who probably do want to engage with Michael and Heather. There's mics.
Can I just ask Michael a quick question while we're waiting?
Yes.
I just was really curious, because I'm very sorry I didn't see it in person, but I was wondering how it smelled.
It smelled good.
Resonant.
Yeah, no, it was the best smelling artwork I've made. You walk in, you get hit with rosemary, geranium. You know, it was really very nice. And I think that was the first thing we all noticed when we were building the space. Is, you know, it's always stressful putting together an artwork, and so people would come in and they'd be like, "Oh, it smells so good in here." I'd be like, "Oh, okay." You know, like, you know, but it had this kind of sensory experience that I wasn't totally expecting, you know?
That's just looking at the photographs, that's what I thought, but obviously, yeah, that's the nature of encountering something for a photograph, isn't it? That's what you miss.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things I've been dying to tell you about your work, I'm a Heather Phillipson superfan, so this is always an honor, you know, to be in proximity to you.
Likewise.
But you know, when I saw the installation at Glynn Vivian, like, one of the things that I was really enthusiastic about was, you know, my own practice. I deal a lot with inflatables, and so I adored the way that you put the parachutes together and you had the fans going. But it also, I think, did something really, really important, really beautiful to understanding the history of conflict as also this kind of material research and technological advancement that always brings wonder at first before it brings destruction. So, like, when we think about, like, you know, whether parachutes are connected to, if we think about, like, the Montgolfier brothers in Paris in the late 1700s, and the launch of the balloons, you know, the hot air balloons, and the promise that it brought, like this escape. You know, you've got the French Revolution coming, you've got the Industrial Revolution, just this misery of two revolutions, but then you have this possibility of escape. And what comes next are the surveillance balloons that are used by, like, the Austrian army to observe, the battlefield. And so all of the kind of space travel that we were all, sort of promised became things like surveillance satellites and everything else. And I think that your project really restored a sense of dignity to that wonder. And it's one of the things that I really love about the work. And at graduate school at MIT, my studio was in the same room where radar was invented.
Thank you.
I feel I'm in the middle of a love-in. It's great, actually. Yeah, question from there. Just wait for a mic, if you wouldn't mind. Thanks.
Thank you. I just wanted Michael to be able to share with the room the idea of activation in the space. We had a tea station every day that got activated by our crew members, and we also had the spice grinding. And I just wanted you to be able to talk a little bit more about that and why you wanted that within the exhibition.
Thanks, Sophie. This is good. The institutional memory of the project is in the room. Yeah, that was one of the things that was crucial about the work, is that it was it wasn't a passive situation. There were stations that were set up. The entire situation was meant to kind of convey that when you walked in, you saw the relief, but then all the plants that were in the relief started to come into the room as real plants. There was a trompe-l'oeil kind of experience of the aqueduct coming out from it. But then these stations that were set up were meant to kind of mimic the blueprint of the Northeast Palace in Nineveh. And so in these different stations, you had the tea service that happened every day for visitors, and the spice grinding, where you could grind all the spices individually to make baharat spice mix, and then also curry spice mix. There was a tincture station that was administered by the Dalston Physic Garden. And then there was also the food service and the tea drying station. What was cool about also the spice grinding station is that there was like this love letter from one of the preparators to the space, where he designed the spice grinding station to look like the ziggurat of Ur, and all the different spices fit into these different cavities that he made. This incredible artist named Ant Makari did that. And then there were benches. There was a reading room at the back. Am I forgetting anything? Okay. Yeah, no, it was a real gathering space, and it was nice to know that those smells would follow people home, and they could put it in their food as well.
So it tasted good as well as smelled good, Heather. Yeah. The question at the back there. Okay, we can go and have tea in a minute. I've got just one more question for both of you. The 1418 legacy has a very specific resonance out of the First World War. This institution has commissioned and explored art's relationship to conflict for a century or so now. It's up to us, I suppose, to determine what the legacy of 1418 will be within the museum. But how connected do you feel to the art of the past that has worked with and around themes of conflict? Michael?
I think I feel connected to most work in general. Like, the way that I think about our lives is that we're just the tip of a vector of time that began a long time ago, and so I feel a certain responsibility towards what's been made before. So when my team and I reappear these artifacts that are either looted or stolen or being held hostage by museums, I think about the fact that the hands that we're making these things with now are connected and in dialogue with the hands of sculptors whose names were not recorded in history. So I feel very connected to that. I also feel very connected to work that has been anti-war for a long time. And in fact, it was years ago that somebody revealed to me that I shared a family line with Siegfried Sassoon, who himself was a Baghdadi Jew. And thinking about those kinds of efforts, through art to do things like what Ken was saying before, that he didn't want to work on conflict, but wanted to think about peace, and to think about the fact that there aren't enough like anti-war memorials or anti-war monuments, thinking about the 1418 Legacy Project, my hope is that, like we're talking about World War I, and I hope we don't have another one. It was supposed to be a war to end all wars, and clearly it wasn't. So I think that, I feel very connected to the impulse of a lot of that art to do something different. I mean, in the first session, it was mentioned that humans make war and they make art. And one of the things that I love about art is that sometimes it is something that goes above and beyond language. But war does that too. It's considered a collapse of language. But I'm always going to fall on the side of art. And that, to me, is, what I get attracted to when it comes to the works of the past. And that even comes with recognizing the fact that I'm reappearing objects that were made under the brutal Assyrian Empire. But after 2,500 years, those have become vessels for our grief. And that, for me, is the magic of art history.
Heather.
I think maybe it's less direct because it has to be less direct for me. I think I look at artists who have historically responded to war. I'm thinking of people like Picasso's Guernica or Goya's Disasters of War, or even, and this is different, but like the Futurists and their relationship to the First World War. And for me, that capacity to respond to something that directly while it's happening. And in fact, even Michael is able to kind of respond to current events in quite direct ways that I think I find too overwhelming or too difficult, or I haven't got enough space from them to be able to work out how I could transmute them into art in some way. But I think Michael's point about gestures of hope actually is perhaps more where my work often positions itself. Perhaps one of the most important for me and most simple and straightforward, Yoko Ono's Imagine Peace. You don't really get much more expansive than that, and everything starts with imagination, and that's obviously what art has the capacity to do. And if you can imagine it, that's the first step towards making it happen. And that's what I always hope art might have the capacity to do as well. Whatever art is about, activating different kinds of worlds. And if it can do that for somebody and they can imagine a different kind of world or a different future, then that's the start of something.
Absolutely. There's always hope when there's art. That's what we want to believe, and we should believe. I think the legacy of 1418, it's too early to decide, but I think what's interesting about that whole commission nationwide is there's a kind of generosity that underpins it. I think what's very clear from both of you and the works that you've produced is there's a kind of generosity too in that. So thank you both very much, and congratulations on what you've done. We look to the future for its legacy, and thank you all for attending. Thank you very much.
Thank you.